Hello everyone, Colin Canet here for Woodwork Web. It's been quite a few years since I talked about table saw blades, so today I'm going to revisit that topic. But if you're new to this channel, I invite you to subscribe, click the notification bell, and let's get started with saw blades. Now before we start cutting some wood, I want to take a minute to talk about saw blade anatomy, because the more you know about saw blades, the better choices you can make. This blade is what we call a full kerf, and you'll notice that the teeth from side to side are quite a bit wider than this blade. This is called a full kerf blade, and that's because the teeth are about 1/8 of an inch or about 3.18 millimeters. This one is called a thin kerf blade, and the teeth on this are about 3/32 of an inch or about 2.4 millimeters. The difference between a full kerf and a thin kerf is pretty simple. You can tell there's much more carbide on the full kerf, so it's wider, it takes more material, it cuts more material, makes more sawdust, but the teeth are much bigger, so they're going to stay sharper longer, and you're going to get more resharpens out of a full kerf blade. A thin kerf, on the other hand, is more for saws that are a little bit underpowered, not as much carbide, so there's less width, less material to take away, less sawdust, and a little bit easier to push this blade through the wood because there's less blade to go through. For most people with home workshops and smaller table saws, maybe contractor type table saws, a thin kerf is often the most desired blade. Industrial companies and companies that are doing a lot of woodworking will often select a full kerf blade. In most cases, the purpose of using a better quality saw blade is to get a better quality cut. And some of the things that make a difference, for example, I have two blades here. This outside one is called a ripping blade, and ripping blades typically have fewer teeth, usually 24 to 30 teeth. The blade in the background here is called a crosscut blade, and they typically have from 60 to about 90 teeth, and you can see there are that many more teeth. Now, a couple of other features of saw blades. In front I have a ripping blade, and you'll notice that the ripping blade has large gullets, and that's because a ripping blade is used for ripping natural wood and ripping the length of it. So there's long fibrous wood material, so we need a long gullet to help remove that material so the next tooth can come along and cut it. This little knob in the middle, this is called an anti-kickback tooth, and it does work. It helps to reduce kickback. The blade in the background is a crosscut blade, and you can see that it has many, many more teeth, and it has tiny gullets because this blade is now cutting through the cutting across the grain of the wood, so it doesn't need to remove stringy parts. It's now removing more sawdust, but because it's cutting across the grain, you need many more teeth in order to make a nice fine cut. Another option in blades is something called a combination blade, and this one happens to be a 50 tooth, and you'll notice that it has some large gullets, but it also has some smaller gullets. So this blade will do both ripping and cross-cutting. The disadvantage with combination and general purpose blades is they usually do an okay job of ripping and an okay job of cross-cutting. If you want really good quality, you're best to go to a dedicated ripping or a dedicated cross-cut blade. You'll get a little bit better cut from those. Now I've moved over to the table saw, and we're going to do some cuts now. And the first blade that I'm going to use is the ripping blade, and the ripping blade is for running long cuts. Typically you're running long cuts of wood. For the ripping blade, I'm going to show you a rip, I'm also going to show you what happens when you cross cut with a ripping blade. I'm not going to use the plywood. I am going to show you what happens on the melamine material. So I'm just going to go ahead and run all of that, and then we'll have a look at it. Okay, let's look at the oak first of all, and I wrote top on that because the blade was driving in from here. We're going to flip it over in a second to see the bottom, but you can see that that's a very nice cut. In fact, you can't even see that cut until I move that. If you just look at that. Now, when we flip it over, the telltale side is on the bottom because that's where the blade is coming up. So it's driving material out. But even on the bottom, again, you know, you have to really look pretty hard to see a line on there. So that does a very good job of ripping natural wood. Let's have a quick look at the cross cutting, and that's where the cross cutting happened, and you can see I wrote top on there. And again, on top, it doesn't, there's where you can see the wood actually matches up there. You can see it didn't do too bad a job, although it still tore out even on the top, which is, the top is going to be the easiest part for the blade, but when we flip it over, and I don't even have to go very far, you can see that the back side, it's torn out terribly bad, but even on the underside you can see there's wood fiber all over the place that has been torn out, and that's why you don't use a ripping blade to cross cut, because it tears out all of those fibers. Let's have a quick look now at the MDF material, the double-sided melamine, and again I wrote top on there. And you know, it's not so bad on there. You can see the line, but watch when I flip it over. This is the telltale side, and look at that. That's just plain ugly. That has just really devastated the bottom of that wood. You'd be very hard to match that up in any kind of a glue up. There's just too much tear out. I've installed my crosscut blade in there, and this particular blade is a 90 tooth. I also have a couple of 60 teeth blade, and the 60 teeth, the difference between the 90 and the 60, like anything else, the more teeth, the little bit finer cut you're going to get, but there's nothing wrong with 60 teeth blades for cross cutting. Let's look at our cut, and of course the first one was the cross cut, and look at, I can even line up the grain on there, and you barely can even see a line where that was, but the underside is where the telltale is, and when I flip that over, look at that. It's just line up that grain. Again, you can't even really see where that line is. It's such a good blade. Okay, let's look at the cross-cut results, and here's the oak, the first one that I cut, and you can see that it's beautiful and crisp. I can even line up the grain on that, and until I actually move, it's almost impossible to see the line, but the underside is the telltale. That's the hard part, and look at that. When we line that up, it's just a excellent cut there. No tear out at all. Very good blade. And there's the plywood. And you can see, you can just barely make out the line on that. And when we flip it over, again, the very crisp lines on there. There's just, you barely can tell where the line is on that. And there's the melamine material, and you can see where I wrote on there. And again, very small, fine cut on there. No tear out on top, but you would expect that. Underneath, you almost have to move that to see, and you can see there's the outside of another cut that I made. You can see what the ripping blade did, and there's the ripping blade. You can see the difference. There's the cross-cut blade. Very fine, no tear out at all. Just a nice fine cut all the way. Okay, I've just installed my combination blade, and I'm going to, because this is a blade for ripping and for cross-cutting, I'm going to rip. Then I'm going to cross-cut the oak. I'm not going to bother with the plywood because it's basically the same as this. I am going to run through the melamine so you'll be able to see what kind of cut that you can get from that. So let's get started. So there's the combination blade and there's the ripping, and you can see that if I were to glue that up, that'll glue up pretty good. It's not quite as good as the ripping blade, but you can see the line, but it's pretty good. And when we flip it over, there's virtually no tear out in the bottom, so that's very good for ripping. Let's look at the crosscut version of that. And there it is there. And it did a pretty good job of that. You can see there's still a tiny bit of tear out in the top. And if I show you the edge here, you can see where there's a fair bit of tear out on there. But when we flip it over, which is really the telltale sign, it's actually pretty good underneath there. There's really not much tear out at all there. Okay, let's look at the melamine now, and we can see that even on top, there's a few little rough spots on top, so not ideal. The underside is a real telltale sign, and you can see that there's quite a few rough spots all the way along. It's not as bad as the ripping blade, but not nearly as good as the crosscut blade. So that concludes my video for today on some of the basic information on table saw blades and information you can use to help you make better choices. Some of you will be disappointed I didn't cover more, but I plan on doing that in future episodes, so stay tuned and check back for more information.